Good evening and welcome to one and all. It's a pleasure to see so many smiling faces and so many smiling names of people. I want to take a moment to thank our outstanding YoVAL committee for just generating one really spectacular event after another. I'm not sure how you do it. If anyone has missed a session, rest assured the recordings are on our website and they're all easy to access. You know, next week at this time, we'll be celebrating the holiday of Purim. We'll be reading the Megillah. And I just wanted to share with you a fascinating medrash about the arch-villain that we read about next week. This is what the medrash says. Amar Rabbi Levi arurim hem harishayim shehem mitaskim be'etza ra al Yisrael v'chol echad mehem omer atzati tova mi'atzatcha. According to the medrash, Haman didn't just view himself as a enemy of the contemporary Jewish people who happened to be living in the Persian Empire all those years ago. He saw himself as part of a grand constellation of anti-Semites over the course of human history. And what the Megillah is telling us that Haman was playing a game of one-upsmanship with those who came before. The Medrash goes on and says the following. Amar Haman, shote haya parosh amar kol haben haya leud haya ora teshlichu. Ani eini osekin el al hashmid la rogud la beid minar v'yatzakein tafan Hashem b'yom echad. Says back in Egypt there was that maniacal tyrant, that Pharaoh, but he was a failure. You know, he had the right ideas, but he only decreed that the male children should be thrown into the Nile. He let the other half of the population live. What a terrible mistake. He says, I, Haman, I have a much more expansive plan. I have a better agenda. I'm going to make sure to murder every last Jew. It's a haunting formulation. We all know that anti-Semitism is the world's longest hatred, the world's oldest hatred. But part of what makes it so scary is that enemies of the Jewish people are always coming up with new tactics, new strategies to improve upon their predecessors. You don't need me to sit here and tell you these days we're feeling it from both the right and the left. You don't need me to tell you that it's virulent, it's hateful, and that we have to use every resource that we have at our disposal to snuff it out wherever and whenever we find it. Part of our goal tonight is to address some of the important but often unasked questions related to these thorny issues. Beyond the conversation that we've organized, we invite you, members of our listening audience, over the course of the evening to participate by submitting your questions, the questions that are on your mind and have been bothering you in recent days and weeks. We invite you to submit them in the chat. It should be addressed to Ora Weinbach, our community educator. She'll collate them, and hopefully we'll have a chance to entertain them at the end of our program. We're fortunate tonight to have with us two individuals who know a great deal about these issues and who can help us think through them and think about how to frame them, particularly as they relate to many of the issues of racism and prejudice that we've been talking about and thinking through over the past few months. Clint Odom is known to many of you. He's been the National Urban League Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy and the Executive Director of the Washington Bureau in DC. He served in senior staff positions in the US Senate and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, during both the Clinton and Obama administrations, a graduate of Louisiana State University and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He practiced law at Cooley LLC and served as executive with Verizon Communications. Just a few weeks ago, he became vice president for strategic alliances and external affairs for T-Mobile. We would say mazel tov, congratulations, Clint, on your new position. I think most of you know Sefi Kogan, a proud member of the Jewish Center and an integral part of our YoVAL team. He's the global director of young leadership for American Jewish Committee. He is the coordinating, in that role, he coordinates the organization's activities for the rising generations of American Jews. He oversees AJC's Leaders for Tomorrow advocacy program for high school students, its campus affairs department, and AJC's Young Professional Division. Many of you also know him from his very popular podcast, Jews of the Pod. It's a pleasure to turn things over to Sefi, and we hope you enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Levine, for that thoughtful and gracious introduction. I'm well aware that the last thing anyone wants a moderator to do is give an introduction after the introduction. So we'll dive right in just a second. But first, please let me just say, what an honor it is to get to moderate this conversation for our beloved Jewish-centered community, and to play a small part in this incredible series that Virginia and Aura and so many others have put together. And B, I want to say what a pleasure it is to share this stage with you, Clint, an incredible ally to the Jewish community in the fight against anti-Semitism. Our work brought us together as the American Jewish Committee and the National Urban League struck up an official partnership last year. But I know we both felt an instant connection, a kinship when we worked together. I cherish Clint's friendship when we chat about the things that we both love, like history, religion, and service, and all the more so when we have conversations about more fraught topics. So Clint, thank you for joining us this evening.
Seffi, thank you for having me, and thank the Jewish Center and Rabbi Levine. This is it's a high privilege to be here with you.
Terrific. I hope you'll all forgive the inelegant segue now as I shift into my first question about what we mean when we talk about structural racism. We've all heard examples, I think, of structural racism or institutional racism that just very obviously, kind of on their face, they make sense to us, right? We understand that redlining in the 20th century, for example, still has an impact today on the wealth of Black families. That's obvious. It's clearly historically unjust. And I think Americans are more and more coming around to the view that it would make sense to see some form of policy action to combat that injustice. However, I think this discourse in which it feels like the terms, racism and white supremacy are used with increasing frequency, sometimes the discourse sounds odd to the Jewish ear. Whether we're talking about slavery or redlining or other such historical injustices, it feels weird to have this kind of, the cost of entry to the conversation being to acknowledge that we are responsible, because for the most part, we and our ancestors weren't even in this country. Certainly not in positions of influence when those racist structures were being put in place. So Clint, how do you think American Jews should grapple with those two kinds of competing instincts? On the one hand, believing in and being entirely committed to equality, and on the other, not believing that it's truthful here for us to kind of, beat our breasts and proclaim ourselves to be sinners on these issues.
Right. Well, I was intrigued by Rabbi Levine's opening remarks and the story that he told, because it actually dovetailed very nicely with how I think I want to answer this question. I want to challenge the notion that slavery or the legacy of slavery or redlining are things that are historical, because they are very active and they're very real today. There's a solid through line between the compromise enshrined in the Constitution that people of African descent should only be counted as 3/5 of a person. Their humanity, both legally and metaphorically, was sliced and discounted. Move forward to the emancipation of slavery, of former enslaved people. That was followed by Reconstruction and a backsliding of all of the gains that African Americans made in voting. There were 3 Southern states, many people don't know this, where there was a Black majority in those states, according to the first census after the Civil War. Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. But because those Southern slaveholding states wanted the political power of African Americans, but none of their humanity, we created an electoral college to help rectify that gap. Fast forward to the 1960s, when literacy tests and poll taxes and violent extremism were used to prevent African Americans from voting. we had to pass a federal law to protect the right of African Americans to vote. The day after that law was passed, the state of South Carolina went to the United States Supreme Court and challenged the legality of the statute. At every moment of apparent gain of rights or liberty or recognition of African American humanity, there is a counter, there's a backlash against it. And if you have any doubt about that, I'll ask you to close your eyes for a moment and think about the January 6th insurgency at the United States Capitol. And instead of that insurrectionist crowd being white people, think about that crowd being mostly Black people, trying to prevent the certification of the results of an election. Do you think for one moment that there would have been only one person who was shot and killed by a police officer on that day? I would hope that among friends, we could say in a candid moment, that probably wouldn't have gone down like that. So this notion of historic wrongs really needs to be corrected to say these wrongs that are continuing and ongoing in nature, and that we have to continue to fight against, lest we go back to the way it was. The second notion in your question is really an explicit or implicit statement that allies must take blame or be or bear some guilt or responsibility for the horrible institution of slavery. And I don't think that's at all what the social justice movement of today is about. The real question is, once you believe that and can agree that there is historic and systemic racism in the country, then the question must be, do you respond to that in an anti-discriminatory way or in an anti-racist way? As a trained lawyer, and there may be those who are watching today who are lawyers, you know that we have been trained to eliminate discrimination, to root it out from employment, root it out from admissions, root it out in social customs and mores. That's anti-discrimination. But anti-discrimination does not fix historic wrongs. It just puts people at the same starting line and fires the starting pistol and says, go. And then when these gaps appear in performance, home ownership, wealth, education, health, we just have to throw our hands up and say, well, the law doesn't fix that. The law doesn't address that. The law only puts people at the starting line together. What we are asking people, American Jews, all people, all allies, is not to say, I feel guilty about the way things are, or my ancestors somehow contributed to this, but to be able to say, our own personal history tells us that the passage of time alone does not fix anything. There must be constant repair and restoration in order to have any kinds of gains. The sin is not who your ancestors are. The sin is when you do nothing or fail to use your agency to fix the things that are wrong in the country. So I certainly understand the tension that you must feel when people are telling you, on the one hand, to join this movement and support this movement, and somehow suggest that because of what your ancestors did or what you did or did not do, this is what has brought us to the current place that we're in. I would just say to friends and allies, be committed not to the notion of equality, but be committed to the notion of equity. How do you use your power as an ally to help correct and address historic wrongs that, left only to the passage of time, will just get worse? And we will continue to see and just live with a permanent underclass or a permanent inequities in our culture.
I when you mention that starting line analogy, that bring someone to a putting everyone at the same basis and kind of like letting them go from there despite inequities that might be in their past, I realized I had this moment. Aura, who is so good at organizing this incredible series, has been on my case about sending her follow-up materials to send out to people. And when you said that, I was like, oh my goodness, I know what I should have sent to Aura, because LBJ in 1965, and I'm sure you know this, Clint, he gave the commencement address at Howard University. And this is someone who, would kind of, LBJ contains such multitudes because he's someone who would kind of casually use the N-word in social setting, and also, shepherded civil rights, landmark civil rights legislation. And what he says, and if I can send this to you, Aura, afterwards, I will. He says, but freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him and bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Which I think, that is the kind of rhetoric that we could imagine, being said, or more likely being kind of put into a pretty graphic on Instagram today. And it's really stunning to see that from LBJ, 50 plus years, 55 years ago.
He was a complicated man, to be sure. I love the Robert Caro book, Master of the Senate. I've so many historical facts about LBJ and what it took to pass the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. A complicated person, to be sure, and maybe even a paradigmatic example of someone who on the left can harbor prejudice and bigotry and racism, and yet still be an important figure in eradicating those things.
Yes. Okay. On to question number 2, which brings us into the topic of anti-Semitism. This is a multi-part question. So
I've got my pen. I'm taking notes. I'll get
we'll go
every subpart.
We'll go part by part. So in my work at the American Jewish Committee, we have identified several different distinct flavors, if you will, of anti-Semitism. And I want to go kind of flavor by flavor here. One of them is really easy, I think, for us to address vis-a-vis kind of Black-Jewish relations, because these anti-Semites are our joint enemies, right? That's the anti-Semites, the anti-Semitism that comes from the right. The white supremacists hate us both. They march in Charlottesville to defend a statue of noted racist Robert E. Lee, and while they do so, they chant, Jews will not replace us. It's all kind of intertwined. So can you tell us a bit, Clint, from the perspective of a leader in the Black community, about how you see kind of the Black Jewish connection there in fighting that hatred and what that means to you?
And we talked a little bit about this, Sefi, on your podcast, and I remember the conversation. I'll start by saying we have to draw on our shared history of faith as a means to navigate social and political obstacles. When I think about comparisons between the African American community and the Jewish community, that is the one that just leaps from the pages of history and is most resonant and most obvious, to me. Dr. King's success, and Dr. King, of course, patterned his nonviolent resistance on the works of Mohandas Gandhi, right? But he also tied it to a very unique religious foundation in this country. African Americans have the highest, one of the highest percentages of people who identify with their faith. The Black church historically, as it continues today, is a real source of power in our community. And at every milestone in civil rights gains in this country for African Americans, the church and religion was squarely in the middle of it. I also think about African Americans fighting against the scourge of anti-Semitism in the form of Nazism during the Second World War, where they left their homes to liberate Jews and to fight against that Nazi regime, and in many ways to try to restore the freedom and the freedom to practice your faith and the freedom to be to not be killed, to fight for freedoms that they themselves did not have. There's a horrible history of soldiers, African American soldiers, who returned to this country after the First World War and the Second, who in fact were lynched. They could not, in their own country, have the rights that they were fighting for other people to have halfway across the world. That's the other thing that sticks out in my mind. And of course, the last thing that sticks out in my mind is the participation and strong membership of Jews in the civil rights struggle, particularly in the South. We marched together, we bled together, we resisted white supremacy and racism together, and even at the cost of our lives. And most people know the story of Goodman Chaney and Schwerner. That, in my mind, was one of the high watermarks of Black Jewish unity to fight back against the scourge of racism and anti-Semitism.
Your reference to World War II, I think, reminds me of the story that our new Secretary of State Tony Blinken shared of his stepfather who had escaped at the very end of the war from a death march or from a camp itself, and he found an American tank and sank to his knees and said the three words in English he knew, which were "God bless America," and it was a Black GI who stepped out of the tank and brought him to safety. Which even I mean, he tells it obviously far better than I just did, but even just thinking about that story,
that's pretty moving. That's a pretty moving account, and the way you told it was very moving. So you must be a podcaster in your day job.
Okay, the next two types of anti-Semitism I think are a little more challenging for this conversation. There's the persistent strain first of anti-Semitism on the left. It's easy for Black people and Jews to align on fighting white supremacy. But what about when we call out left-wing anti-Semitism? Like when people who say that Israel, the Jewish state, should be destroyed. And sometimes, as we saw with the platform released by the Movement for Black Lives, they lob these attacks at Israel under the guise of racial justice. What would you say to Jews who feel that the Black-Jewish alliance doesn't extend to allyship on Israel, which for our community is such a central kind of core advocacy issue?
Well, and I think Rabbi Levine made this point in his opening remarks, and I'll echo them here. Racism or anti-Semitism, is not the exclusive province of any side of the political spectrum. It exists on both sides, and it exists in the middle. Dr. King spoke very eloquently of this phenomenon in his letter from a Birmingham jail when he addresses clergy, priests and preachers and rabbis who told him and the community of Black community of Birmingham, just be patient, just wait for a better time to press for your rights. This is really a kind of bigotry. And among what were at the time almost certainly allies of the civil rights movement, just saying, just wait for your time. It's not quite your time, but just wait. There is bigotry in the form of, we talked about LBJ. LBJ, to some people, advanced the cause of civil rights, not because he believed in in equality for all people, but because he was looking for a way to give the Democratic Party a permanent advantage with Black voters whose voter registration going back to the 40s and 50s, especially from Blacks who migrated from the South to the North, were really exhibiting tremendous political power. Black votes in many ways were delivering Democratic presidencies to the White House, or Democrats to the White House. Again, and then of course there's the soft bigotry of low expectations that we hear people on the right talking about. Our alliances really extend as far as our experience. I would say more people probably need to travel to Israel and the Middle East to have a better understanding of what the hell people are even talking about. That famous Rabbi Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, said, one of my favorite quotes from him is, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime." I suspect that some of what you've described today was uttered or written by people who have not stepped foot out of this country and have not stepped foot in the Middle East or have gone, to Israel. I would urge anyone on the left or the right or the middle to do that and then see how that experience changes your views. Congress has the ability to censure people for saying all sorts of crazy things, but travel and the kinds of things that we're engaging in right now has the ability to change people's minds and to change their hearts. And I would hope that more people take advantage of the opportunity to do just that.
We at AJC were so excited to travel, to sign an agreement to travel with you and your colleagues at the National Urban League. I think AJC and the Urban League are going to be heading to Israel sometime in 2022 together. Unfortunately, I guess now we need to sign one with the folks at T-Mobile in order to.
I can pay my own way, but if I could just carry some luggage, that would be. I'm raring to go.
That brings us, that if I can just wipe the smile off my face, that brings us to the most uncomfortable form of anti-Semitism, which is the anti-Semitism that is endemic to some forms, some segments rather, of the Black community. It's dated now, but James Baldwin wrote quite a bit about this. Some of what he wrote I find frankly horrific, and other parts of it I find deeply kind of empathetic. What are we to make of Black people who say, as Baldwin did, we don't hate Jews because they're Jews, we hate them because they're our landlords or because they're white? Or what are we to make of the Louis Farrakhan's of the world? Or what are we to make of the people who were bashing Jews over the head with bricks in Brooklyn last year?
Yeah. Well, I think as a general matter, I tend to avoid listening to people whose sole intent is to arouse passion and who are really trying to make points that are wholly unrelated to anything that's really important. And it's easy to kind of put Louis Farrakhan into that bucket. He's a sensationalist. He's a recruiter. He's really trying, I'm not sure if he's trying to win the argument, but I think he's trying to appeal to a segment of the population that certainly doesn't represent, all Black people, not even all Muslims. So I would say let's not give people more power than they actually have. The second thing I would say is we should avoid generalizations of all types. Whenever I hear people talking about making sweeping statements about people. And the Baldwin example is very interesting. I don't know if we have the ability to put that essay into the chat, but I mean, you paraphrased it perfectly. In April of 1967, I think in the New York Times, Baldwin published an essay called "Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white." And there is much there to be shocked about just in the title. And it is worth reading in its entirety. I make no defense of the essay, but it is certainly worth reading. And I think is a masterful example of why we should not generalize and overgeneralize. And I think Baldwin was probably doing so, was using that technique with great intent to make other points. And I think it's probably important for our listeners to go back and read that essay. I would also say that we should avoid giving too much weight or credit or influence to people who do not speak truth. And that includes half-truths. The most pernicious thing about a lie is not the lie itself, but it is almost always in the way that a lie is wrapped with something that is true, in a way that poisons the truthful part and is intended in its entirety to be poisonous. You could make an easy example of Louis Farrakhan to make that point. You could probably make that same point with the former president. There have been people who documented hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of misstatements that were made by the president. This is not a political point that I'm making. As recently as the impeachment trial that just took place in the United States Senate, the president declined the invitation to testify, as we all know, because he probably would not be up there and tell the truth under penalty of perjury or conviction. But what was so pernicious about the president was that he often wrapped an untruth in a truth, not because he wanted to win the point, but he wanted to divide people. And I think we have to be careful about listening to people whose sole intent is not the truth of the matter asserted, but the intention to divide people. And I think that may not be a wholly satisfying answer, but it is really the way that we get past, or it's the way that we avoid giving too much agency or power to people who are not good people and who have no intention of speaking in a way that brings people together. Their entire raison d'etre is to separate people and tear them apart.
You raised this really important question, Clint, of who do we listen to? One thing that I find deeply upsetting is when people hold up Jews and Jewish voices who I know are not representative of the Jewish community, and they hold up their opinions as though they are. So, for example, members of Congress like Ilhan Omar and Jamal Bowman, already in his short time in Congress, he's done this too. They'll retweet something from an anti-Israel Jewish group, and statistically, that kind of anti-Israel position represents about 3% of the American Jewish community, and community rather. And what they say, what they say by doing this, in effect, the way I read it as a Jewish person is like, look, these good Jews get it. We need to take some kind of action against Israel, and even the Jews agree. So when I see that, that really bothers me. On the other hand, there are some Black voices who I often find really brilliant, but who a lot of, progressive Black activists will say that they don't represent the community. And probably a lot of people, with us tonight have someone in mind, people like Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter or Chloe Valdary or Thomas Chatterton Williams, or throw it back, he's no longer with us, someone like Albert Murray. Look, I get, as you said, that there's no Black person who speaks for 50 million Black Americans, any more so than there's, any one Jewish person who speaks for 6 million American Jews. But I don't want to be guilty of the same thing that I hate to see people do with Jewish opinions. So who do we as Jews who want to listen to the opinions of the Black community, want to not only listen, but to help uplift those perspectives, who should we be listening to?
I could rattle off a long list of people who I think in contemporary society are heroes of mine. There are a lot of people in the faith community. I think about Reverend William Barber, who has really been a successor to the Poor People's Campaign, who has shined a real light, an unflinching light on poverty and neglect in this country. Not just as it pertains to African Americans, but poor people who are white, poor people who are brown, poor people of every stripe and every dimension. I find him to be a person of very clear moral view. But listen, I can't explain the actions of Ilhan Omar or Jamal Bowman. What I would hope upon hearing these things is that you would not give up on them either. They represent us and all of us. I mean, if you just take a look at the district that Jamal Bowman won, this is a young man that we have to put our arms around, not only and pray for him, but to teach him as well. And I think it would be a mistake to give up on any of these folks. I think you have to put your arms around them and extend to them the same kind of hospitality that you've extended to me, in hopes of getting through to their hearts and to their minds. The Congress, I think, and our elected officials do represent the kinds of people that we should listen to. When they speak in vile language, like Steve King, like Ilhan Omar, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, they are censured or they are disciplined by their parties. And I think that's an important first step of taking their power away and not giving them the privilege and a platform to spew views that are hurtful or uninformed. Some of the voices that I listened to after the insurrection on January 6th were people like Chuck Schumer, people like Cory Booker, people like Mitt Romney, who I felt did the one thing that I said earlier in my remarks that we should do, and that is to speak truth, not shaded truth, not mostly true, but pure, unadulterated truth. The truth is not something that you negotiate. It's not something that you say, I'll take a little bit of what that person said and a little bit of what that person said, put it together, ergo, it must be truthful. We know what is right and wrong, and we know what is truthful and what is not. And I find in moments like this, and even our president, Joe Biden, I believe, has distinguished himself at times early in his presidency as being a person who speaks truth and has the intention and the ability to bring people together at the time where that kind of unity is most desperately needed. So listen, you ask a person who's been in Washington for 32 years who he listens to, you shouldn't be surprised that it's a politician, or politicians can sometimes do it. But I really do feel that politicians reflect not only their constituents, but in those moments when they decide in a profile of courage or to take some action that is not in service of their reelection, that those people should be listened to. I think about the senator from my home state of Louisiana, Bill Cassidy, a rock rib conservative. I've not known him to be particularly a champion of civil rights or of much that I agree with politically. But he took a very brave stand coming from a state, one of the deepest red states in the United States, my home state, to say he thought Donald Trump was guilty of inciting an insurrection. Regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump or Bill Cassidy for that matter, you know what kind of strength it takes to say, I'm going to do something that I know is not supported by a majority of the people who sent me here. And he felt what he was doing was in defense of truth and defense of the democratic institutions of the country. So truth is spoken all the time. You just have to tune your ear for it. But it's still out there.
I'm in the unfortunate position of still working for a nonpartisan nonprofit. So I'm not going to touch those politicians, except to say I'm sure that there are a lot of fans of many of the people that you mentioned with us tonight. Probably some non-fans as well, but a lot of fans.
Oh, sure.
Okay, the last question I have for you before we get to some of the phenomenal audience questions that people have been sending to Aura. The last question that I have is the only simple one of the night, but it's definitely not a gimme. It ties in maybe to some of the work that you and I have done in our day jobs between the National Urban League and the American Jewish Committee, and it's this. It's what is the path forward for our communities? What more should we do to support one another in our advocacy aims?
Well, I'll go back to something I said earlier. It is not a sin. You cannot bear the sins of your forebears. You can only bear the sins of your omissions and your acts. And so what I would ask people to do is to look at what actions and omissions they are engaged in during what is one of the nation's, if not one of the world's most important social justice movements. Are you a person who is content to watch it on television? Are you a person who's content to say nothing in the face of the presence of racism or anti-Semitism? Look for ways to get involved. They do not have to always be marching in the streets or fighting in the courtrooms. Sometimes it can be something as simple as what we're doing tonight. The hashtag Black Jewish Unity Week came out of a very modest and chance meeting of a representative of AJC and the National Urban League. And we decided, we were going to take advantage of this meeting and use it to have a deeper and more meaningful relationship. The Jewish Center has all of the power and the proximity to this social justice movement to reach out and see how they can participate in this social justice movement or do more. I don't mean to assume that it's not happening currently, but reaching out and seeing how can we do more. I'm a product of Black Jewish Unity. My former priest was a woman by the name of Rochelle Birnbaum from Westchester County, New York, who converted to Christianity and was raised a Jewish person, and everyone in her family going back many generations were Jews. She decided to become a Christian, and a big part of her ministry was to infuse Judaism in her instruction and her care of her parishioners. The first Seder that I ever attended was presided over and was organized by Rochelle Birnbaum. I think I shared with you the story growing up. A Protestant church on one side of the street, a synagogue on the other. I never knew growing up why we could always use the parking lot of the synagogue across the street on Sundays. Grew up just blitheringly ignorant about Judaism. Since moving away from Louisiana, I've taken every opportunity to get to learn more about my Jewish brothers and sisters, and have become a richer person for it. And I would urge anyone listening to us to take those opportunities to do the same. I think you'll find you will be a better person for it, as will the person that you interact with.
Terrific. Okay, thank you, Clint. Now to the audience questions, and thank you all for submitting such excellent ones. The first one, I'm gonna throughout all this, I'm gonna paraphrase here. The first one highlights a really important point, which is that anytime we talk about Blacks and Jews, we are setting up a dichotomy that doesn't necessarily exist, because there are Black Jews. And it's important not to forget about them, to erase them in these conversations. It's important to make space for them in our Jewish communities, etc. And it's a little bit of an odd question for you and I to engage, because though one of us is Black and one of us is Jewish, that doesn't add up to our being one Black Jew. And I do want to note that our series will feature, I'm noting for our audience here, our series is going to feature a whole session in May devoted to the stories and perspectives of Jews of color. But as someone who has been a professional advocate for the Black community, and as someone who is kind of concerned with issues of race and racism in general, where do Black Jews fit into that picture for you?
Well, I think it is a wonderful, I always talk about the mosaic of this country, and the fact that race itself was an unknown construction for most of the history of the world. If any of you have had the opportunity to go to the Smithsonian African American Museum of Culture and History, you'll learn that it wasn't really until the 17th century, especially around the commerce related to the slave trade, that we started talking about people in terms of the color of their skin and all of the mythology that was associated with it, the sort of carving up the world into Caucasoids, into Negroids, and to Orientals. These classifications were pernicious in their origin, and they continue to be pernicious. We have to deal with the world in which we live, and I think there's nothing more beautiful than a human being who is the sum of the parts that her parents contributed. I don't know if I told you this, Seffi. I'm adopted, and didn't find my natural parents until I was in my 50s.
Wow.
And grew up parents who attended, segregated schools, attended historically Black colleges. I lived in a Black neighborhood, went to a Black church. My entire culture was Black until, at 51 years old, I find out that my birth mother was an Irish English woman whose roots can be traced back to Europe to the 1500s. And my father was an African American man whose family were sharecroppers in Texas. The first time those two bloodlines came into contact was at the University of Michigan in 1966. Two of the most improbable people to meet and to date and to have a child, and I'm the product of that. I'd like to think that I carry with me the richness of both cultures, and I represent, the fullness of Black people in this country. So what I would say about Black Jews is they are special people who deserve to be embraced by both sides and ostracized by neither. One of the most influential law teachers in my life was a woman by the name of Lonnie Guinier, who retired recently from Harvard's law school. Of course, I met her when she was at the University of Pennsylvania, and just found her to be one of the wisest and one of the most brilliant lawyers that I had ever met. And I'm 100% sure that she was the perfect reflection of who her parents were. And so, I would say our community should embrace Black Jews because there is God in those people, and we should be proud of them. Absolutely.
Mostly, I'm just shocked that you're 51. I would have.
I used to be 51.
um,
That's how old I was when I found out the secret.
So I guess just yesterday it must have been.
Just yesterday.
You're reminding me. I'll just say this briefly before moving on to the next question. You're reminding me of, in his book, The Omni-Americans, Albert Murray writes that in his opinion, America is not a white culture, and that it's wrong, it's offensive to claim that America is a white culture, as sometimes people do, to kind of, sometimes people who have an agenda, who want to kind of set, Black people outside of, and he says that America is, he says America is mulatto in the most beautiful way, that that Blackness is inseparable from American culture, and I found that very, very powerful, and in many ways we should think about the ways that kind of diversity could or should be inseparable from our Jewish culture. We have another question from the audience here, asking, and I think this is throwing back to your reference to Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, asking, when did Jews' relationship with the Black community change? Why did it change? Is there anything that we can do to restore it? And I'll just add, for my own purpose, the lynching of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner was not all that far removed temporally from the James Baldwin essay that we wrote about. So it's not clear that there's kind of an obvious dividing line. The relationship used to be all hunky-dory then, and then X
Right.
happened, and now it's. But tell us your thoughts on the question.
Well, listen, I mean, on the show we did together, we talked about redlining, how it was not just redlining by race, it was also redlining by religion. A lot of the reasons that New York looks the way it does today is because Jews were, living in certain areas that were almost perfectly, cordoned off by legal lines. There were covenants that prohibited people from selling homes and real estate to Jews, just as there were racial covenants that kept them out of the hands of Black Americans as well. I think the change probably happened, during the late 1960s, as the civil rights movement began to splinter between, do we achieve civil rights through coalitions, multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic coalitions, or do African Americans need to claim their own agency and fight for their own rights, and do so without a lot of assistance from multicultural coalitions? Baldwin's essay itself that we've talked about today points at some of this as well. There's a suggestion in the piece that whatever the historic similarities were between Blacks and Jews, they began to change when Jews came to this country. So I'm no historian, and I can't put my finger precisely on when it happened, but I can give some insight into how I think it can be healed. And that is, we need to be supporters of each other. We must fight against lies that are told, regardless of who utters the lie. I've been very proud to see in the Congress a bipartisan, biracial, multicultural pushback on Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had been, someone who spewed lots of racist and anti-Semitic tropes and narratives. That was a moment in which people got together and said, we're not going to stand for this anymore. I think the battle over Confederate monuments is another area that can bring our communities together. Imagine, and I'm not sure if the analogy is perfect, but imagine if there were in Germany people who wanted to erect monuments to people who, were members of the Nazi Party because, they were descendants of those people, or they felt that those people, were special or unique in some sort of way. It would be an outrage. Come back to the United States, fast forward to where we are today. We have people who were not only slaveholders, but they actually fought. They tried to overthrow the government of the United States in order to keep this institution of slavery going. Where are Jews going to be in that fight? We know in the Congress, there have been some Jewish members of Congress who have said, in a vote on a resolution that we shouldn't remove Confederate monuments from the Capitol grounds. There were other Jews, well, overwhelmingly, the Jewish members of Congress said that we should. I think trying to get some alignment in our communities over these things, can be seeds that can really germinate into restoring, the relationship the way it used to be.
I want to try to slip in one final question, or
sure.
That's okay. Okay, good. This audience member says, I come from a politically conservative Orthodox community in New York. Many of my peers, and presumably also their family, are convinced that Black Lives Matter is violent and that it's kind of inherently anti-Semitic. And this person says that they, have tried to outline, all the reasons why those claims are exaggerated. They know that walking away from such individuals and friendships results in those people kind of burrowing deeper into those hateful views. On the flip side, after months of conversation on the topic, their perspectives haven't changed, and they continue to kind of, to believe these things, and they don't want to validate them anymore by keeping on engaging. So, what's the best way to approach that? How do you? I guess it's just the simple question of how do you change someone's mind?
Yeah. Well, we have lots of examples in this country of people whose hearts and minds weren't changed until things got really personal or real to them. I think about the story in the New Testament about Paul, who was struck from his horse on the road to Damascus, or to Governor George Wallace, who was an ardent segregationist and white supremacist until an assassin's bullet took away from him the use of his legs, or Strom Thurmond, who was an ardent segregationist in the United States and a governor and United States senator, who proudly extolled his views on the supremacy of the white culture, and in fact had a Black daughter that not many people knew about. The point is that we must resist the temptation to walk away from these people, and to walk away from people who could be friends or who are friends. We don't know how long it takes to thaw someone's heart or to change someone's mind, but I would urge anyone who hears my voice to consider hanging in there with that person, not doing it in a way that endangers yourself or subjects you to indignity, but in a way that believes in the potential of all human beings to change, and you being the person who could eventually bring that change to that person's heart and to that person's mind. There's an African-American man who, and I can't think of his name, but who has a penchant for working with former Ku Klux Klansmen and white supremacists in helping them to walk away from that life. And I think of him as a model of how we should all be. We don't. It is in the finest traditions of our religion to not give up on people and to not pray for and be active in their salvation.
Clint, my brother, God bless you. Thank you. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Ora Weinbach to close us out.
Thank you both so much for being with us this evening and sharing of yourself and teaching us. We really are so grateful for your time and your wisdom. In the last minute, I just want to let everybody know about some upcoming YoVAL events. You can get all of this information on our webpage, which is linked in the chat. We have two major upcoming events that you might want to be aware of. The one of them is an evening of personal narratives that's done in partnership with the organization Friends of the Children. We're going to be hearing the life stories and perspectives of 3 New Yorkers and kind of getting into their personal life experience. I believe actually Sister Eli is on the call with us this evening. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to learning more with you. The other event that I would love to tell you about is for those of us in the audience who have children or grandchildren or who are themselves children. We have YoVAL Youth. YoVAL Youth is designed at reaching our young kids, age grades 1st through 12th grade, and it's being facilitated by Dr. Nava Silton, an amazing clinical psychologist in our community, and Christine Gregory is going to be working with our teens. She is the Chief Operating Officer of the NAACP. So if you are a parent and you are interested in learning more about this program for your children, there is a parent information session on this Sunday evening at 8:30, and we encourage you to sign up. There's going to be registration links in the follow-up email that you will be receiving tomorrow. There's also, as always, a feedback form. We love to hear what you have to say. Please share your feedback. We really take it to heart. And it will also include the suggested readings that were mentioned by Sephi and Clint this evening, updated to include the last minute edition. And so we really hope to continue learning with all of you. And thank you again to our panelists for this wonderful discussion. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you very much.